Okay, so we're diving into like a really hot topic in the fencing world right now.
Yeah, it's been all over the news lately. So
It has. It's been everywhere.
yeah, we've got a bunch of sources here. News reports from Fox News and the Daily Mail, a statement from USA Fencing, and then we've also got their like official policy document on transgender and non-binary athletes. The goal here is to give you the, the down and dirty, the basics of like what actually happened, but then also understand the different perspectives here and how this, might impact things moving forward.
Yeah, for sure. And we want to do it in a way that you can listen and get all the information without it being, like a whole college course on the topic.
Yeah,
So let's jump into it. The big event was March 30th, 2025, Cherry Blossom Open in Maryland.
right at the University of Maryland.
Yep, and it was a USA Fencing sanctioned regional tournament. And the big thing that happened was this female fencer, Stephanie Turner, got disqualified.
Yeah, and all stemming from her refusal to fence against her opponent, Redmond Sullivan.
Redmond Sullivan, who is a transgender athlete.
Correct. And this is what has really, sparked all of this discussion and debate.
So let's break it down like exactly what happened step by step.
Okay.
So March 30th, Cherry Blossom Open. And this is before her match with Redmond Sullivan. Stephanie Turner takes a knee and removes her mask.
Right. A very visible, a very deliberate action.
Yes. And so the immediate consequence, according to the International Fencing Federation rules, the FIE,
Right.
is a black card from the referee and disqualification. And this is specifically Article T113. And it's basically there to maintain the structure of the competition, to make sure it's fair to all the athletes, that if you're entered properly, you're expected to participate.
Yeah. You can't just refuse to fence someone. So, it's important to try to understand Turner's motivation here, why she did this. And she actually told Fox News that she believes Sullivan is a man and that it is unfair for him to compete in a women's tournament.
Right. And that was her reasoning behind her actions.
Exactly. And this is something that we see a lot in these discussions around transgender athletes in sports, is this question of fairness and, what constitutes a level playing field.
And it's important to note that Redmond Sullivan actually had previously competed in the male category before transitioning.
Right. He had a history in men's fencing.
Right. And in this particular tournament, he had actually finished 24th out of 39 competitors.
Okay, so sort of middle of the pack.
Yeah.
Okay.
And also it's worth mentioning that Redmond Sullivan hasn't commented publicly about all this.
Their profiles are all private right now.
Okay, interesting. So keeping things pretty close to the vest.
Yeah, it seems that way.
Now, this wasn't just, a spur of the moment thing for Stephanie Turner.
Right. It seems like there's some history here.
Yeah, there are reports that say that she's actually avoided tournaments in the past where she knew that transgender fencers would be participating.
Wow. So this was clearly, a very conscious decision,
Yeah.
a deliberate protest.
Yes. And her stance on this issue is clear.
Okay, so she's been thinking about this for a while.
So let's talk about the reactions, because this is where it gets really interesting. We see the different perspectives coming out.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Stephanie Turner, as we mentioned, her whole point was, fairness in women's sports. And she brought up a concern that I think a lot of people share about biological advantages that transgender women might have.
Right. And this is a very common argument.
Yeah.
This idea that maybe even with hormone therapy, there might still be some residual physical advantages that could impact competition.
Exactly. And this is a very complex topic, obviously.
There's a lot of nuance here.
Yeah.
We're talking about things like muscle mass, bone density, and the science on this is still evolving.
Right.
It's not a simple yes or no answer.
So Stephanie Turner, she got some significant support for what she did.
Oh yeah, she definitely had people in her corner.
For example, Martina Navratilova,
The tennis legend.
huge tennis legend.
Yeah.
And she came out publicly and said that she thought the disqualification was unfair.
Wow. So that's a big name, lending support, and that definitely brings more attention to the situation.
Absolutely. And there's this organization called XXXY Athletics, and they gave Stephanie Turner a $5,000 Courage Wins Award.
$5,000.
Yes, and offered her a place in their leadership program.
Wow. So they're really, putting their money where their mouth is. They clearly see her as someone who's standing up for something important.
They called her a hero.
A hero.
Hmm.
Yeah. So, this is a great example of how these advocacy groups can really step in and shape the narrative around these kinds of situations.
For sure, no, USA Fencing, they issued a statement to clarify their position on all this.
Right, because they're the governing body here. They're the ones who ultimately, make the rules and enforce them.
Exactly. And they were very clear that the disqualification was only because she broke the FIE rule about refusing to fence it. Had nothing to do with her personal beliefs about transgender athletes.
Right, so they're trying to separate the action from the motivation behind it.
Yes, and they pointed to their 2023 policy that allows transgender athletes to compete based on their gender identity.
So they're saying, look, we have a policy in place. This is how we operate.
Right, and they also said that they're committed to inclusivity, but they have to follow the FIE regulations.
Right, so they're kind of caught in the middle here. They have to uphold the rules, but they also want to be inclusive.
Exactly. And they did say that they are open to making changes to their policies in the future based on, new research and what's happening with the Olympics and Paralympics.
Okay, so they're not closing the door on potential adjustments down the road.
So you've got this strong support for Stephanie Turner and her actions, but then you've got USA Fencing saying, we have to follow the rules.
Yeah, it's a tough spot for them to be in. They're trying to balance these competing interests, and there's no easy answer here.
And the public is divided, too.
Oh, I bet.
Social media like X and Reddit just blew up. So many people were saying she's an American hero. She's standing up for what's right.
Right. They see her as someone who's bravely fighting against an injustice.
And then other people are saying, no, this is discrimination. She's being transphobic.
Right. They're saying, she's denying someone their right to compete.
And some people were even saying that the entire competition was tainted and unfair.
Wow. So it really struck a nerve with a lot of people, this whole situation.
It really did.
Yeah.
And then to make it even more complex, the Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton got involved.
Really? I hadn't heard about that.
Yeah, he actually announced an investigation into USA Fencing.
An investigation?
Wow. Yeah, he said that they might be violating Texas consumer protection laws.
How does that even apply here?
Well, he's basically arguing that their policies are, hurting female athletes and that it's misleading to say that these competitions are fair.
Okay, so he's taking a very strong stance on this.
He said he wants to defend the integrity of women's sports.
Right, and he's using his power as Attorney General to try to do it.
When they're going to be looking at all sorts of documents from USA Fencing to see if they've been doing anything that could be considered, deceptive or misleading.
Wow, so now we've got the legal system getting involved. This is getting really complicated.
So let's talk about the actual policy itself, the USA Fencing 2023 Transgender and Non-Binary Athlete Policy.
Okay, so this is the document that lays out the rules for transgender athletes.
Right. And they say that it lets athletes participate in events based on their gender identity, regardless of what they were assigned at birth.
Okay, so that sounds pretty inclusive.
But there are some specific criteria.
Okay.
So, for example, if you're a transgender woman who wants to compete in the junior, senior, or veteran categories, you have to have completed at least 1 year of testosterone suppression therapy.
Okay, and that's a pretty common requirement. You see that in a lot of sports organizations. It's based on the idea that testosterone can have a significant impact on athletic performance, and they want to make sure things are as fair as possible.
And you have to provide proof of this hormone therapy.
Right. You can't just say you've done it. You have to have medical documentation.
So this policy is their attempt to create a system that's inclusive, but also addresses these concerns about physiological differences.
Right. And it's important to remember that the FIE rules were the reasons Stephanie Turner was disqualified.
Yeah.
She broke a specific rule by refusing to fence.
And that rule is there to ensure the smooth running of the competition.
Right. And it also highlights how these different levels of governance, the national bodies, the international federations, sometimes their rules might not align perfectly.
Now, Stephanie Turner has said that she considers herself a new Republican conservative.
Okay, so she's aligning herself with a particular political ideology.
And she said that this whole issue of transgender athletes in women's sports was part of the reason she made that shift.
Right, so this is clearly something that she feels very strongly about.
She also supports President Trump's position on cutting funding to schools that have policies that are inclusive of transgender athletes.
Okay, so she's taking a very public stand on this issue and connecting it to her political beliefs.
It's a good example of how these things can be very personal and how they can influence people's broader worldview.
Absolutely.
So what about the fencing community itself? What are some of the thoughts and opinions there?
Well, one idea that's been floated is that maybe women's regional events should only include biological women.
Okay, so going back to a more traditional format.
But they also acknowledge that local mixed events can be fun and inclusive.
So maybe keeping it separate, the more serious competitions versus the more casual ones.
Right, and there's even been talk of maybe having a separate category for transgender athletes in the future.
Interesting. So kind of like how they have different weight classes in some sports?
Exactly. Yeah. It's an idea that's been proposed in other sports too, but it's not without its challenges. Logistically. How do you implement that? How do you ensure that it's fair and equitable for everyone?
Right. And then Stephanie Turner, she actually voiced a concern about potential bias from referees.
Really? What did she say?
She told the Daily Mail that she'd been hesitant to bring up her concerns with USA Fencing before because she felt like there were a lot of pro-transgender individuals within the organization, including some of the referees.
Okay, so she's worried that that might influence how matches are officiated.
Exactly. She's concerned about fairness and impartiality.
Yeah, that's a really important point. If athletes feel like the playing field isn't level, that can undermine their trust in the whole system.
Absolutely.
So has anything changed? Have USA Fencing or the FIE announced any policy changes as a result of all this?
Well, as of April 8th, 2025, when most of our sources were published, there hadn't been any immediate changes.
Okay, so things are still kind of up in the air.
Yeah, but remember, USA Fencing did say that they're open to making adjustments in the future, if new research comes out or if the Olympic and Paralympic policies change.
Right, so it's definitely a situation that's still evolving.
And one last thing to highlight is the support that Stephanie Turner got, not just the award, but also the message behind it.
Yeah, the Courage Wins Award. It's a very powerful statement.
It really shows how much this issue means to certain groups and how they see her actions as something to be celebrated.
Yeah, it's a reminder that there are many different perspectives on this and that it's a very complex issue.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, you've now got a really clear picture of what happened with Stephanie Turner at the Cherry Blossom Open.
You understand her reasoning for protesting and what the immediate consequences were.
And we've looked at the bigger picture, too.
Yes.
The different opinions from within the fencing community and from the public in general.
We've talked about the policies that USA Fencing has in place, the FIE rules, the legal implications, and even the political aspects of this whole situation.
It's amazing how one event can touch on so many different topics.
It really is. It's like a microcosm of this broader debate about transgender athletes in sports.
So this is something for you to think about now that you have all the information.
What are the most important things to consider when we're talking about fairness and inclusion in sports?
How can organizations like USA Fencing create an environment where everyone feels welcome and respected, but also make sure that competition is fair and equitable?
It's a tough question with no easy answers. Yeah. But it's a conversation that we need to keep having.
And this situation in fencing, with the protests, the policies, and the public reaction, it's a perfect example of how complex and nuanced these issues can be.
It really is.
And before we go, we want to thank our sponsor, Fencing Family.
They're an Etsy shop in Los Angeles.
And they have the coolest fencing-themed apparel and accessories.
Super comfy and stylish, perfect for wearing year-round.
You can find them at https://fencingfamily.etsy.com.
Check them out.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
We'll see you next time.